Welcome to the debut of Impact Portsmouth, presented by Wild Adventurous Life. How's the sound? Is the sound okay? We were testing when there was lots and lots of noise in the room. It's good? All right, perfect. So are you guys excited? Yeah. All right, there's been a lot of build up to this event, man. I think we probably launched it like 2 or 3 months ago, and then you guys bought your tickets like mad people, and then we just had to wait. So here we are. So I'm Jennifer DeRogers, and this is the amazing Emmy Cats, and we are honored to be your co-host tonight. You are in for an incredible show, or shall we say, adventure. First, let's talk a little bit about adventure. What is adventure? What does it mean to be adventurous? Allow me to tell you a quick story. Several years ago, I took a trip to Peru with a dear friend named Melissa. We were going to climb Nevado Ashinka at about 20,000 feet. That day, I experienced a level of exhaustion and altitude sickness I had never endured before. At the end of our 14-hour expedition, we were finally back at base camp, and I was huddled in my sleeping bag, dangerously dehydrated. It was at that moment that Melissa said something to me that was so profound. She said, "Tomorrow, when I ask you if you will ever climb a tall peak again, you will laugh at this pain and you will say yes." And that's exactly what happened. The most memorable moment of the day was sitting at the peak. I felt more joy, more energy, and more clarity than I had ever felt before. That's what an adventure is all about. It's not without hard work, bumpy trails, or a whole lot of uncertainty. Adventurous people understand that it's all about the journey, and they take comfort in the discomfort. What makes adventurous people so inspiring is that when adventure calls, they answer.
Wild Adventurous Life's mission is to inspire personal transformation by having an adventurer's mindset. Our online blog and curated events are fusions of our passions for wellness, travel, healthy living, vibrant food, and the outdoors. It is our intention to promote community, contribution, curiosity, creativity, and personal fulfillment. We know that setting out on any great adventure can be scary, but we ask you to trust us, to lace up your shoes and go out there anyway. At Wild Adventurous Life, we believe if you choose to see life as a series of adventures, you are limitless.
Impact is a speaker series curated to inspire you with life stories told by movers, shakers, and change makers. These are the stories of how one's life experience can inspire a mission, and how one's mission to do great things can change the world. Tonight, we are going on three very unique, inspiring journeys. Each one of our speakers answered their call to adventure by defining their personal mission and courageously taking bold action. You'll hear how they've overcome obstacles and fear and remain steadfast to see their missions through as their life's work. And if that wasn't amazing enough, somewhere along the way, while these people were changing the world, the journey changed them too. So here's how Impact works. Each speaker will have 30 minutes to tell their story. As you can see, it's just you and them. No projectors, no stage, no podium.
We want to extend a huge thank you to Liar's Bench for hosting us tonight. We hope you We hope you enjoy their deliciously crafted brews and thank them for all they do for our community. We also have free bottles of still and sparkling water at the bar. Shout outs to Rhea from Rhea on Assignment and Miles of Seacoast Flash for capturing this event. Thank you. Just a little heads up, there's a camera in the back, and while we're sure the back of your heads are beautiful, just try to keep your eyes forward. And also help us spread the word by following us on Instagram at Wild Adventurous Life. Post, share, tag your pictures with the hashtag Wild Adventurous Life and the hashtag Impact Portsmouth. Wild Adventurous Life is honored to say that 100% of the proceeds from tonight's event will be donated equally to the nonprofits selected by our speakers. If after you hear their stories you feel inspired to donate a little further, there's a donation jar right at the back, next to my husband over there. There'll also be some goodies and other swag at the check-in table. There'll also be plenty of time afterwards to meet the speakers personally. All right, let's get started. Thank you all so much for coming. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.
Our first storyteller is Kathleen Dodge. She is the grandmother of Laney and Lou Cafe's director of culinary, Miles Underwood. When I talked to her on the phone, she was so humble, calling herself just a retired teacher from Vermont. As you will find out, she is that and so much more. The reach of her work extends some 7,100 miles away from here. Please welcome to Impact Portsmouth, Kathleen Dodge.
Let's see if this is good. How's the sound? Is that good? Okay. You know, I think a few of us set out to change the world. And for me, all I wanted to do is sponsor a girl's education. And everything that happened after that was nothing that I orchestrated or expected. And when I was listening to the introductory remarks, I really believe that we don't set out to find our mission. Our mission finds us. And then if we're listening and we follow, amazing things really do happen. And so that's about what you're going to hear tonight, is that the mission that found me and where it took me, I didn't create it. And so we're going to call that Sophie's story. There came a time when I felt a real desire to give back. And being a teacher, I thought the most appropriate thing is to sponsor a child's education. And with the help of a friend who lived in Western Kenya, a young girl was identified. Now, Sophie, it's typical of the young girls who grew up in Western Kenya, in rural Kenya. Her mother was a nurse. Her father was a dairy science gentleman in the industry. Both her parents died of HIV/AIDS. Sophie then, with her younger brother, went to live with Grandma. Sophie being the youngest, but Grandma, who was in her late 70s, had at that time 3 other grandchildren from her other son's family who had died of AIDS. So there were 5 little ones in the house with an aging lady, and Sophie, being probably 11 at that hour or at that age, was taken out of school to care for the little ones, her brother and her younger cousins. Sophie was the child that was recommended that I sponsor. Now, when you sponsor, or when I sponsored, Sophie was then placed in a very well-structured and highly academic boarding school, which is protocol in Kenya for youngsters who want a good education. They go to a boarding school. And as Sophie grew toward she was getting close to graduation, I felt such an impulse for wanting to do more. By that time, I was retired, and I thought I have to figure out a way to do more. So I started buying lottery tickets. And every Saturday, I bought 2. And of course, nothing falls from the sky. And I picked up on that after about a year and a half. And I realized that my message is that if I wanted anything to happen, I really had to. The solution was me. I had to come up with a solution. And the only collateral I had was my reputation as a teacher. So I thought, all right, I'll draw on that collateral. And I wrote up Sophie's story. She was just about to graduate. And I sent it out to 100 people. Students, people who I'd known, networked with, who I'd worked with, friends, acquaintances, people I knew in the community. From that outreach, the next year, 8 sponsors stepped forward. So now we have 8 children who were being sponsored now in high school. The year after that, we had 15. And the year after that, we had 23. Time to put in place some structure and organization. I gathered a core of like-minded people and friends, and we formed a 501c3, a nonprofit charity. Put in place some project manager in Kenya, and started treating it like a business. Started treating it like, with the integrity and the oversight that the service really deserved. So, about that time, we said, golly, where are all the girls? We're getting wonderful applicants for our 10 scholarships a year. It's not a lot, but it's something. Where are all the girls? Why don't more girls apply? And then we learned this, that in rural Kenya, 40% of the girls in rural Kenya do not finish grade 8. We learned that the girls' scores were low, and they weren't qualifying for our scholarship cutoff point because girls were missing a week of school every month because they didn't have sanitary supplies. We learned that in this region, over 200 girls in every single school zone drop out of school every year due to pregnancy, early marriage, or poor performance from frequent absence. So that came to a board of directors made up primarily of women, and that sat hard. And we thought, we have to do something about this. What shall we do? And so the rest of the story for the girls program comes out of that question. We established a partnership with 6 primary schools in the district, and they became our partner schools. We launched a 3-prong girls empowerment program: education, material supplies, hygiene, and sanitation. And I'll take each one of those. So in the beginning, our approach began with girls' clubs. We formed girls' clubs in each of the 6 partner schools. We found a volunteer teacher in each of the schools who would be the teacher mentor. And once a week, girls in grades 4 through 8 gathered together with their teacher mentor to have a platform to discuss issues of common concern in a place that was supportive and trusting, where they could be trusted. And during these after-school meetings, we focused primarily on boosting girls' life skills. Rural girls from traditional families are very reluctant to talk about adolescent issues, puberty, sexual relations, how to keep themselves safe. All of that is taboo. And so the girls learn it through talking with older girls and, unfortunately, through hearsay from the boys who are ever so eager to help the girls understand that premarital sex is really going to help them to make sure they'll have children when they finally get married. So, yeah. So education was an important part, and we delivered that through the girls' clubs. We developed a girl-child manual for these teacher patrons so that they would have discussion points that would guide them through discussions during these weekly meetings. Curriculum topics were really aimed to improve girls' health awareness, build self-confidence, and really improve their decision-making skills. Now, to ensure that girls would be able to stay in school during their menses, we established a partnership with a group of local women, and we commissioned them to make reusable sanitary towels. We had never heard of it, but they had done quite a bit of research for their own daughters and for their own immediate families, and we put them to work. And so these ladies working on treadle sewing machines would produce 5 reusable pads for each girl's dignity kit. That was our solution. We distributed dignity kits to our adolescent girls. And the dignity kit consisted of 2 pairs of underwear. Girls don't have underwear. 2 pairs of underwear, a set of 5 reusable sanitary towels, and we taught the girls how to keep those washed and cleaned and sanitized, and then some emergency pads as well. Twice a year, we would make sure that the adolescent girls in those schools received dignity kits along with their weekly education meetings with their teacher patrons. And what we found coming out of those 6 schools in relationship to the other schools that didn't receive these services was astounding, and we realized that we were obviously on to something. As funding allowed, we expanded to the next group of 6 schools. So within 4 years, we had all 23 schools, all 23 primary schools in our zone were our partner schools. The parents were ecstatic. Almost half the population in Kendu Bay, this is Western Kenya, live on $2 a day or less, if per family. They are peasant farmers who grow their own food, or fishermen. It has the highest AIDS prevalence in all of Kenya, 25%, compared to the national average of 6%. A lot of education needs to go on in that region. It has the 2nd highest rate of adolescent pregnancy in Kenya. 33% of adolescents bear children before the age of 20. So parents were so grateful. We used the Dignity Kit distributions as a community education event where parents, community leaders, school officials, government officials all would gather. We would have speakers. It was used as to raise awareness on girl-child issues and to really petition the community and the government officials to get behind girls' education. They call them girl-child education. And and the farmers and those who could not afford to give their daughters sanitary supplies, they would wring the hands with gratitude of our project leaders, saying, you know, it has been so hard for me because my daughter would hide at home when she was having her period, and we knew she was missing school. So it helped everybody. And we have a lot of community and government support in that regard. While Girls Club became the vehicle for education and raising health standards, health understanding among the girls, what we realized is that a social aspect was required. Girls really needed social interaction to build self-esteem and to build their social skills. So we created debates with neighboring schools. And each week there are debates going on between neighboring schools of the girls' clubs. The topics are established in advance. The good part about the debates we discovered was that debates require advanced preparation and research and planning. And these are skills that they are not getting in their normal classroom. However, as the debates continued, teachers were saying, we're seeing the girls bringing those skills right back into the classroom. And the headmasters were saying, we have never seen our girls be so comfortable standing and addressing a group of people, expressing their opinions, advocating for their sisters. So it has been a great support for the whole of the school community. In 2009, 125 adolescent girls received our first distribution of Dignity Kits. This year, over 2,000 girls will receive Dignity Kits supplies so they too can stay in school and build their skills. Now, so what came out of all of this? Oh, I forgot another aspect. That's why it took us so long, it took us 4 years. At each of the schools, we also partnered with the school community, which means leaders of the parents group, to construct gender-sensitive latrines, girls' latrines. Broken doors and shared facilities were really hampered girls' attendance during their periods. They were so afraid of being humiliated they'd stay home. So it was really important to construct a gender-sensitive latrine for the girls so that they had the confidence of privacy and their personal privacy was secure. So those three things, the education, the material supplies, and the hygiene, sanitation, was a setup at each of those 23 schools. And I'll get back to that question. So what came out of all of this? Well, girls' school dropout that had been over 200 girls was dropped to 4. Pregnancy at one school alone when we first started were 14 girls. In 23 schools for the past 2 years, 0. All right. The program boosted girls' high school eligibility from 43%, 100%. All of our girls are now qualifying for high school. Now, in Girls Club, there are 3,400 girls who are participating in our girls clubs. So after a few years, you get these girls, they've become used to being leaders and organizers, setting up the meetings, telling girls to sit down and be quiet, choosing the topics, being the debaters. Well, it really pays off after a few years. And not only that, their girls' class performance has improved dramatically. For the first time ever in this school zone, the majority of top performing students are girls. Girls now hold position number 1 in 75% of all classes 1 through 8. Isn't that awesome? Yeah. So that was our girls program. Then those capable girls now are folding back into applying for the scholarships. So as we continue to link sponsors with deserving students, we have, as of this year, more than 200 Kendu Bay youngsters have received high school education through our sponsorship program. And because we make sure the students are placed in highly competitive, very good schools. There are tens of thousands of high schools in Kenya. The good schools are the boarding schools. Those are the schools that if your youngster can attend one of those boarding schools, they're going to get a whack at a government scholarship for college. 90% of our kids qualify for government scholarship to university and get university degrees on, as a scholarship. So that it's a double return for a sponsor who supports a youngster's high school education, and then to see that youngster dig in and put in the hours and the work and reap the benefit of the degree. And finally, 3 years ago, we became aware that the government of Kenya supports schools in general in Kenya, per capita $1.35 per student per year for textbooks. Okay, so go into a rural school. The kiddos are barefoot, they sit on benches, there's no back, there are rough-hewn boards for desks, and hardly any books. So what we did is we thought, all right, we'll have a book drive. Good old book drive. We put out a blurb in February or March. Whatever money we raised for the book drive, we disperse among our 23 schools. Often it's $100 to $200 per school. That amount, focused where the school identifies its greatest need, has made such a difference. Scores have risen in just those 3 years between 23 and 50% at those 23 schools in just that little bit of time. So a little bit can go a long way. Now, for all of you, and you're all half my age, life began for me after retirement. You see, that all of this happened well after I had retired. And so if you're listening and you're responding to a desire, and then you make a decision and you throw yourself upon you bring good to the world is going to bring good to you. And I'm really convinced that the triggers are infinite for us all of what creates this wild, adventurous life. What triggers us to make a new move. But I am convinced that when we throw our weight to a good cause, that and we join it with love, the universe is going to come. You're joining the universe. It's going to come right back at you. Yeah, just put on your seatbelt and enjoy the ride.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for sharing your inspiring story with us. And it's been truly an honor to have you here as one of our speakers tonight. Let's hear a round of applause another for Kathleen. If you keep tabs on the opioid crisis in New Hampshire, chances are you've heard of our next storyteller, Sandi Coyle. She's one of the foremost recovery advocates, using her powerful journey with addiction to inspire hope and pathways for recovery for others. It is my overwhelming honor to welcome to Impact Portsmouth, Sandi Coyle.
It's an honor to be here tonight, and it's especially an honor to be part of the first opening night for this Impact Speaker Series, and to celebrate with Jen and Emmy. That this is just really exciting. I've known Jen for a little while, and actually really from when this part of my story kind of started, because it was so beautifully introduced that our stories tend to find us, and if we're bold enough and wild enough and adventurous enough to walk through the pain and the hardship and the uncertainty and the fear and the excitement and the success, just staying awake to it all, good things do happen, wild things happen. And 13 years ago, I didn't think I would have a story to share with anybody. And really in the last 3.5 years, I took a yoga teacher training class, and for any yogis in the room, my hat's off to you, because for me, I didn't come out as a yoga teacher. I came out with a nice, expensive therapy bill, really, because that shit just cracked me open at a time when I needed to be cracked open. So I guess my story started, I guess, in 6th grade, really. So I often introduce myself first as a person in long-term recovery from alcohol and other drug, including heroin addiction. And for me, that means that I've been sober for almost 13 years. And by being active in my recovery, it's given me a life second to none, and a sober mom and a sober daughter. And I've been able to use the experience that I had because of addiction as a message of hope in a time when that message of hope has been really important, because we've all been touched and exposed to the devastation that's really happening out there. And so when I was 13 years old, my life didn't look from the outside any different than anybody else's. I grew up in a good family, Irish Catholic. That might be part of the problem. I love the line when people say, as Irish heritage, you can shake my family tree and Budweiser bottles fall out. That's probably the case. So, but for me, when I picked up my first drink, it put me on a pathway that it didn't put everybody on. And I was susceptible to the disease of substance use disorder or addiction or whatever you want to call it. And even before my first drink, by the time I was in 6th grade, so my problem's not with alcohol and drugs. That made everything that much worse. But when I was in 6th grade, so I was 13 years old. I have a 6th grader right now, and he's almost 12. So 13, 14 years old, I felt compelled to, as an adolescent, uncomfortable female, like many of us, I found diet pills and CVS pharmacy, right over the counter. And then I found cigarettes. And the diet pills weren't because I was overweight or because I thought I needed to lose weight. It was because being uncomfortable in my skin felt kind of unbearable. And when I found substances, it just changed the way I felt. And it seemed fairly innocent. I found No-Dos or something too, and would do homework at night or empty the dishwasher and feel like all jacked up, and it made emptying the dishwasher fun. But what happened for me was kind of this progression of harder drugs and alcoholic drinking and behavior and choices that were against my morals or against my values, hurt the people that loved me, and took away opportunities and the potential that I had for life, for living life. So I went through college. I had graduated high school. Actually, I get asked a lot, like, how does addiction happen? How could you prevent it? Like, why did it happen for you? Or how could we stop it from, having other people go down this path? I think part of the epidemic that we're seeing right now is very much from like trauma. And what my trauma looked like looks different for other people. And what I needed was a way to escape the things that I didn't know how to deal with, or escape the feelings of discomfort that I just didn't feel like I had the playbook for. And drugs and alcohol, and just kind of seeking outside of myself became what I thought was the solution. And eventually that search for a solution or just changing the way I felt started to change me, and I became physically, emotionally dependent on substances to just be able to go through life. And that left a spiritual void in me that was really just filled up by darkness. So when Jen and this evening was introduced as people willing to live vulnerably and boldly and adventurously, that's definitely been the case, because what happened through that time was stuff that 13 years ago, as a 26-year-old, and for the first time in my life, starting to walk a pathway committed to recovery and to sobriety, I thought that all of that stuff that had happened was I was ashamed of it. I was afraid of it, and I thought that it was best kept a secret from anybody else. So at the age of 26, I was a college graduate, thank God. And I had really been kicked out of my mom's house. This is kind of funny. So I thought it was a good idea. I went to high school in New Hampshire. I'm from out like the suburbs of Northeast Philadelphia, and this whole place up here was like culture shock. So at the end of my drinking and drugging, so how heroin started for me, right? Because I introduced myself as a heroin addict, or as a person in recovery from heroin, and I'm sure that's really intriguing to people. So how that story started for me, I was 18 years old. I had gone to Kearsarge High School out in like Sunapee area. And once I graduated, I went in to get the crap out of here really quickly. So I went back to Philadelphia, which is where I was from. I went back to a summer of all of my friends graduating from high school and getting ready to go off to college. And there was a lot of partying, going into Philly to the clubs, a lot of fun. Like, it was fun. And one night, after like going dancing, a couple guys showed up, one of my girlfriend's boyfriends, and we were all pretty lit, and somebody put down something, white powder on the table and said it was Ready Rock. It was crack. So Ready Rock sounded okay. Didn't sound like crack. I don't know, had I been told this is crack, I don't know if I would have done it. But at that point in the evening, my decision making was a little blurred anyway. So snorting a white line, and I wasn't alone in making that choice. And then, so as we were all kind of really amped up from just doing this Ready Rock, somebody introduced, what was it called? Smack. And it was more white powder, and snorted that. I wasn't putting a needle in my arm. I wasn't doing anything that had, that I learned in DARE or anything, right? And so that became another progression into driving down to Northeast Philadelphia. I had a white Volkswagen Cabriolet convertible with a Bob Marley sticker on the back and 3 flower petals on the bumper. And I had long blonde hair, and I would tie it up in a messy bun. And I was, adorable 19-year-old, had everything going for me, and I was driving down to Northeast Philadelphia, buying bags of heroin. And I proceeded to do that for about 8 months. I had a gun held to my head one night, just in places that I had no business being in places that my mom and my stepdad were at home watching TV, having pizza, never imagining that their daughter is doing these things. I remember one night getting high and going to South Street in Philadelphia, and we kind of tucked into this alley, and we just kind of did a little bump, and the feeling was quite euphoric. So when we all feel baffled by how people are making these decisions, drugs and alcohol serve a purpose, and they work for a lot of people. But what unfortunately happens is that the drugs that are out there now, the places that this stuff takes people, is death, and at least to a place of darkness that starts to feel like you can't get out of. And I sat there that night, and I remember looking down the alley and seeing people walking down back and forth South Street, enjoying the evening, shopping with their families, having a good time, and I just felt like I was completely missing out on life. And I didn't know how it got to that point. I eventually got arrested and was given a choice to do community service and go through some treatment and start to try and make better choices without having too much consequences. So that was definitely a wake-up call. So 13 years ago, I found myself back in New Hampshire. I had no place to go. My mom wouldn't take me back. I had burnt that bridge. And my dad lived in New Hampshire and said, you can come up here and stay with me, or you can come up here and I'll pick you up, and I'm taking you, you can't stay with me, I'm taking you to a treatment facility. So in March of, I'm so bad at numbers. So March of 2004, I came up to New Hampshire from Florida. And how I got to Florida, that was the funny part I was going to tell. So I was living in Richmond, and I was at the end, had just graduated college. I was living with my mom because I couldn't afford to pay my rent anymore, and my roommate didn't want to take half of it and going to the bar Friday nights anymore. And it was just around Daytona Bike Week, so around March, I think. And I called my friend's dad from New Hampshire. I told him to pick me up off at a hotel off the side of 95 in Virginia. And I thought that I would go and find my prince on a shining Harley, and I would just go off on a different course. And that didn't happen. I ended up in Florida, and I could barely put a sentence together, and my options quickly became calling my parents to try and get it out, or doing like bikini car wash. So I called my dad. Ended up in New Hampshire with like a bathing suit and jean shorts and tank tops in March. He dropped me off at a treatment facility, and that became the first 4 months of my road to a sober life. So at that time, had you asked me, would I have a story to tell or would I have a story to share, it didn't feel like it. I barely felt like I was going to be able to put my life back together to have any meaning. When I took away drugs and alcohol, it left me really uncomfortable with the past that I was bringing, and felt like I had to recover from. So that became a turning point for me when I decided to clench on to a sober life and clench on to whatever it would take to bring hope back into my heart and to bring fire back into my soul and to bring coherent thoughts back to my mind. I was 3 months sober, and I found out that I was pregnant. I was living in Bradford, New Hampshire with my father and my step siblings, and I thought, oh boy. It was actually the first time in my life that I felt so kind of out of control of my circumstances, yet knew in my heart that everything was going to be okay. And I proceeded forward doing everything that I was told, everything that I was guided towards, to live a life of physical, emotional, and spiritual wellness. And that, for me, meant excavating through a lot of shit, looking back at a lot of trauma that happened in my life, both in childhood and as a result of my drinking and drugging, and became willing and committed to grow from that, to heal from that, and to become stronger from that. I spent 9 years, so I had my son on just before my first year of sobriety, my anniversary, and I haven't picked up a drink or a drug since then, and he'll be 12 in June, and thank you. And when I found out I was pregnant, I also now became a partner to his father, and a stepmother to 3 of his kids. And I took that path with everything that I had. I loved all 4 of the kids equally. I was a partner to my husband. I participated in the things that helped keep me well. I needed to connect to a community, and I think that's what's so powerful about tonight, and what's happened for me in my life, especially over the last 3.5 years, is that I've been able to connect to communities of people. And through our community connectedness, through sharing our stories, through being vulnerable, we can change the world. And in a relatively short amount of time, and probably why I've been invited here, in the last 2.5 years, so it's interesting. I'm gonna jump track a little bit. In the last couple of months, I interviewed for a new job, and I went through a really extensive interview process. And in putting my resume together, and in doing that interview, it never crossed my mind to like put a list together of all of the places that I've spoken at and all of the people that I've spoken with. And yet, when I stopped for a moment and I looked back at that, I thought, the opportunities that I've had in the last 3 years are opportunities that not many people experience. Hillary Clinton invited me to speak with her at her first town hall in Keene, New Hampshire, during her kicking off her presidential campaign. That was pretty cool. I've spoke on NHPR a couple times. I have been on Rock 101 with Greg in the Morning Buzz a couple times now. I was an opening speaker at the Democratic presidential campaign debate at St. Anne's Sloan. Oh, this is kind of cool. So just a couple weeks ago, I went to Arkansas and I went to the Clinton Foundation. And regardless, I vote for people. I am, just politics I try to stay out of. And so, despite what your political beliefs are, there are people that have been influential in our country, and Bill Clinton is one of those for me. I think he was actually the first president I voted for. So I went down to the Clinton Foundation unexpectedly a couple weeks ago, and this is what living boldly also brings into your life, is just these crazy opportunities where all of a sudden you're in the flow and you're standing up and you're like, oh my God, what do I do? What do I say? Here I am. And this was one of those moments. So I had no idea how much Bill Clinton was going to have a presence at this thing. And it was a 4 or 5 hour event. I was asked to go last minute, and they were covering a whole range of topics, one of them being the opioid crisis. And I was sitting in the second row, and the panelists were 3 doctors, nobody with lived experience in addiction. And one was talking about vaccine for addiction. The other one was talking about medicating people because of this epidemic, and that's how we would fix this crisis. And another woman was from a state department somewhere. And I was sitting on my hands, just so agitated and frustrated with the conversation, because for me, what recovery has looked like, it's looked like hope. It's looked like people participating in their lives. It's looks like people having opportunities in their community to live wild and adventurously, and to have supports available for them, to help them live spiritually, emotionally, and physically well. And while I won't get into a debate, I will, but not right now, about medication, assisted recovery and treatment. I think that there's a time and place for medication, but I think that just about everybody can live a sober and free and phenomenal life. And if we don't give that enough of a chance, and if we let the conversation go towards medication, I think we're just going to continue to, put people asleep and turn off and really limit the opportunities of life that people have to live. So I was sitting there just painfully anxious about this conversation, and I kept thinking to myself, there's something more, and I was looking at Bill Clinton, and I thought, he's not, like, he needs more, like, this has to go bold. And I just kept getting that mantra, like, go big or go home. And I'm like, Sandi, you just started this new job, your boss is sitting next to you, don't do anything crazy. And then the other side of me is like, do it, like, let it go viral on YouTube or something, do something so stupid that you'll at least be able to, like, you know, say something, because something needs to be said. And my hand is like creeping up my face, and I'm like, no. And all of a sudden, no joke, this is like the, you know, story choosing you. Bill Clinton turned around the first time in the entire event and said, does anybody want to raise their hand? And so I rose my hand and I stood up, and in front of, you know, a couple hundred people and Bill, Hill's husband, I stood up and I took the microphone and I said, my name's Sandi Coyle, and I'm a woman in long-term recovery, and what that means for me is I haven't had a drink or a drug in almost 13 years. And as a result of that, I've been able to be active in my community, give back a message of hope and recovery and opportunity for people that are still struggling. And I've found ways to help our communities heal and recover together, ways that work and ways that we need to all invest in. And for the first time in that morning's event, Bill Clinton put the microphone down, sat back, crossed his arms, and just smiled. And I'll fast forward. So after that, I went to talk to him a little bit, and he stood in front of me like this close, holding my hand, holding my shoulder, and he said, when you introduced yourself and started speaking, it was the first time I felt like I was back in the real world. He's like, you're right. If we don't give people an opportunity to go back to their communities, have social connectedness, have pathways to help them feel better about themselves and to get active in life, to show up as healthy parents, to show up as healthy employees, then you don't know Jack. And he poked me in the forehead. It was great. So my story came out really accidentally. A good friend of mine who's here tonight, Michael Venn, he's also the film producer of The Heroin Effect, which, if you haven't seen it, the first screening was at the Portsmouth Music Hall last month, and they're having a second screening on May 25th. Lights are, I can't see your numbers, 25th. And it's a documentary about a couple of people, or a lot of people's experience in recovery. And the first time when I went on to Greg in the Morning Buzz in December of 2014, Mike heard me that day, and that was the first time in public that on the sound airwaves, that I introduced myself as a person in recovery. And I got a Facebook message not long after from Mike, and he interviewed me for this documentary. And for the first time in 9 years, I shared my voice as a person in recovery. I broke the silence that I had been living for so long. And shortly after, a series of events happened, again, just that kind of delicate thread of life, you know, that when we're walking on it, it feels like a tightrope sometimes. And, you know, you can put your seatbelt on and go for the ride, or you can throw your arms up and just scream. And so shortly after, an article came out on the Portsmouth Herald, and it said, ex-heroin addict plans recovery center. And for the first time in my sobriety, more than a handful of people were going to know it. I had girlfriends that didn't even know I was sober at that time. And after reading that article on the Seacoast Online, which I was getting ready to leave my office that day to go pick up my son from school, and I felt the stigma and the shame of this disease more alive than I ever had. And I went to pick up my son, and all of a sudden thought of myself as an ex-heroin addict. And the next morning I woke up, and the print ad on the paper had a headline called There's Hope. And when I saw that headline, I thought, that's my message. I've been given a chance and an opportunity to share a message of hope at a time when people need healing. And since sharing that message of hope, I've gotten to meet people who have lost their children. I've gotten to meet people that have 20 years of sobriety and are living amazing lives. And I got to become a part of a recovery movement that is not just happening here in New Hampshire, but it's happening across the globe. And there's a lot of people out there doing a lot of amazing things to get people the help they need. May 28th, or at the end of this month, will be a 1-year anniversary for the opening of Safe Harbor Recovery Center. If any of you haven't heard of it, it's just down the street on Islington. And that was my first stake in the ground of what recovery could look like. And at a time when the heroin epidemic started to rise and started to make itself known, I guess was really around the same time that I started to make myself known and to fight back against the epidemic and to hold a flag for hope and recovery. And since then have been able to see people's lives transform as a result of it, including mine. And it hasn't all felt great, but being willing to walk through the experiences, to hold people's hands when I'm scared, to share with people in the joy and the sorrow and the uncertainty, has opened up my life and has opened up opportunities for other people to get the help that they deserve and to live the wild and adventurous lives that are all out there waiting for us. So thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you so much, Sandi. This is such a huge topic, and I think there's probably not one single person in the room that hasn't been touched some way, somehow, by this subject. And Sandi was right. I heard her speak. I already knew her, but I went to one of her first events probably over 3.5 years ago. And when she opened her mouth and started speaking, I couldn't stop crying. And there were 7 other ladies with me, and it was the same way because we had no idea the pain and the struggles that she had moved past. And I think what's super critical about this, and is going to tie in beautifully with Karen, is that Sandi is a beautiful example of someone that moved towards light, towards something very, very beautiful. And what she could have chosen to do was move away from addiction. And you need to think about that for a moment because it's a very different choice, right? So it is my honor to introduce our final storyteller, Karen Kenney. From the streets of Lawrence, she carries a torch for truth and love wherever she goes. And believe me, she tells it how it is. Karen is a passionate crusader for the well-being of all living things. Please welcome to Impact Portsmouth, Karen Kenney.
Hello, beautiful people.
Hello.
How you doing? All right, so thank you so much to these guys for inviting me. I think it's amazing what they're doing. So just a quick round of applause for Jen and Amy. And then also a little bit of love for Kathleen and for Sandi for sharing their stories. Pretty cool. So as Jen was telling you, yeah, I'm a kid from Lawrence, Mass. It's about 30 miles north of Boston, by the Merrimack River. And so my story kind of begins May 1981. And I'm 12 years old, and my mother had gone out the night in question, and my sister and I thought we were so cool because I was 12, she was 13, about to turn 14, and we didn't think we needed a babysitter anymore. But what we didn't realize is that Mrs. Turgeon downstairs was actually keeping an eye on us, but we still thought we were pretty cool. And so the way it worked, if you were ever a teenager, you know how it is. Your parents go out, and you're supposed to be in bed by a certain time, but you never go to bed when you're supposed to. So we would always like hide behind the curtains, and then if we saw my mother's car pull up outside, we would like book it to bed, you know. And my mother was no dummy, you know. She would always come upstairs, and I'd be in bed like pretending I was asleep. And she'd lean in, and as she was, you know, nuzzling my neck, she'd say, "I know you're awake, you little shit." And my mother was the love of my life. She still is the love of my life. She is what I call my true north. My mother had a gravitational pull that you could not resist. She was 33 years old the night that she went out to go bowling. She was a wicked good bowler, too. Both her and my dad, who's actually my stepdad, but I consider him my dad, they were in the same bowling league. But at this time, they were separated. My parents had been separated like 18,000 times, but this one seemed pretty serious. We knew he was already dating a woman named Elaine. And my mother was still madly in love with him, but it didn't seem like it was going to work out. We hadn't seen my father in a couple of months. It had been a while. So my mother went out. My sister and I stayed up. We went to bed. Next morning, we woke up, and I could hear somebody like in the kitchen. My bedroom, we lived in a double-decker, and my bedroom was on the other side of kind of like this partition wall. But I could hear somebody on the other side, and so I said, all right, I got up, and I found my sister, still in her pajamas, standing in the doorway of my mother's bedroom and just looking. And so I went in there, and I stood there, and I looked, and my mother's bed was empty. And this is weird, because it's like 7:30 in the morning. My mother is not a morning person at all. In fact, it was our job to make sure she got her ass out of bed, coffee in her hand, Marlboro Red, you know, before she got to work. And so it was really weird that her bed was empty. It hadn't been slept in. We looked around. There was no note. There was no half-empty coffee cup. There was no Marlboro in the ashtray. We looked outside. Her car wasn't there. And my mother was an insurance underwriter at McCarthy Insurance in Lawrence, and we thought, oh, maybe she just had an early client, forgot to tell us, whatever. And so my sister said, go get ready for school. I'm going to stay home, which I didn't think was fair, but I liked school, and I had a crush on Stevie Bryan, so I was like, okay, I'm going to go. And so I went to school, and my sister stayed home, and the whole time I was at school, I just kept looking at the clock thinking, oh, I can't wait till I go home and I can see my mother, like when she gets home from work. And when I got home from school at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my sister was being wicked weird. And she was on the phone, but she would like, back then, remember phones had cords, right? So we had like this Mickey Mouse phone, and it would sit in this little cubby, and she had the fucking curlicue cord stretched so far around the corner that it was like straight. And she wouldn't, like every time I came in the room, she'd be like, get out of here. So I didn't know what was going on. I just kept saying, did you hear from Ma? You talked to Ma? And she says, no. So my dad was a Wonder Bread guy. So we always had like Twinkies and stuff in the house. So she's like, get some Twinkies, go watch TV. So I went around the corner, I got my snacks, I'm on the couch watching Tom and Jerry and loving life. But knowing something, I'm like, something's not right. Why is my sister acting this? I mean, she was always a jerk to me, but, you know, that's how it is with siblings that are a year and a half apart. So I'm watching TV and I hear a car door slam outside, and I look out the window and I see my father getting out of Ronnie Bonanno's car. And Ronnie Bonanno was like, we called him Uncle Ronnie, he wasn't really our uncle. And I was like, why is Ronnie dropping Dad off at the house? My first thought, and then my second thought was, I was just so psyched to see him. My mother was the love of my life. My father, I worshiped the ground he walked on. I was in equal amounts fear and awe of him. My father never hit us, but he poked us a lot. Don't do it again. He would slam my sister up against the wall, because my sister, like, I learned how to keep my mouth shut, you know? My sister would just say whatever came to her mind, which means she was the one that bore the brunt of the suffering. But anyways, I see him and I'm just psyched. And so I turn around, my sister hangs up the phone, and I say, it's Dad. And I take off down the stairs, and as I go, I hear her say, what the hell is he doing here? Because all she knows is that when he's around, she is going to suffer. So I run downstairs, and I look at him. My dad is my stepdad, but he's Italian and Portuguese. So even by like May, he's got a pretty good tan going on, right? He's a really good-looking guy. And so we come onto the porch. I see him, and just as that happens, Sue Turgeon, who's my sister's best friend, who lives downstairs, she opens up her door, and my father says, go back inside. And Sue knows better than to mess with him, so she shuts the door, and I look up at him, and I'm like, hi, Dad. And he doesn't smile back at me. And he says, come on, kid, let's go upstairs. We go upstairs, he says, sit down. So we both sat on the couch, my sister and I, and he sits down on the coffee table in front of us. And he won't look at us, and he just puts his hands on his knees, and he's just looking down. And then he looks up at us, and he says, all right, look, I'm just going to tell you, your mother is dead. My sister freaks out, she takes off, and I say, Dad, what happened to Ma? And he says, you don't want to know, kid. You don't want to know. And my sister starts freaking out. Now, my father loved toughness. That's one of the things he loved about me. I was a girl, but I looked like a boy. I acted like a boy, and so I didn't cry. He didn't hug my sister. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer any condolence. He wasn't touching me. Nobody was hugging anybody, so I just thought, oh, I'm not supposed to cry. So I just stuffed it all down. My sister's freaking out. She's doing enough crying for the both of us. And she starts screaming, what happened? What did you do? What happened? And he says, I don't know all the details yet, but it's already in the paper. It's going to be a pretty big deal. And he gets up and he walks into the kitchen. Now, my sister knows that the Tribune comes like at around this time, the Lawrence Eagle Tribune. So she hauls ass downstairs and she grabs the paper. And just as she's grabbed the paper, a friend of my mother's comes to the house. Because unbeknownst to me, and I wouldn't know this for 27 years, because nobody in my family ever talked about it, my sister had been calling people all day long looking for my mother. So she showed up, and my sister, I can hear her screaming down on the porch, he says she's dead, he says she's dead, he says it's in the paper. So Dot, my mother's friend, sends my sister into Sue's house, and she comes upstairs with the paper, and she slaps it down on the table, sees me, and she takes off into the kitchen to have it out with my father. So they're doing their whole thing. My sister's downstairs, and I'm sitting there by myself. I'm 12 years old. My mother is dead. And I imagine I'm in some sort of shock. But I also hear in my head, it's in the paper. And so I'm fucking terrified to look. But I've always been a curious kid. My mantra when I was a kid was, why ma, why ma, why ma, why ma, right? So I pick up the paper. It's folded in half. And I'm like, okay, I've got to somehow find the courage to look at this thing. And so I just kind of took it in sections. Like I would flip it one way and look real quick, see nothing. So this is it. This is the paper that I see. And at the bottom, on the front page of the Lawrence Eagle Tribune, it says, "Woman's body found." Methuen. The partially clad body of an unidentified woman was found this morning at 11:45 a.m. by cemetery workers on Nevins Road. According to Police Chief Francis Morse, the woman's body, with the head mutilated, was found near the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, Hillside Acres Cemetery. Morse, who called the medical examiner to the scene, said police were unable to identify the woman. Methuen detectives and state police are investigating. And so when I read this, I think, they're talking about my mom. And I'm a smart enough kid to know that partially clad means that she didn't have some of her clothing on. I would later learn that she was found half naked from the waist down. Head mutilated. She couldn't be identified because she had been beaten and kicked to death. Her face was so unidentifiable they didn't know who she was. And she had been left there to die on the side of the road. I found out later that she actually died from all of the injuries. Her death certificate says multiple blunt injuries to the head and the neck. But I've talked to all the detectives on the case. I've talked to a bunch of different people, and they all said, your mother ended up choking to death on her own blood. Nobody in my family ever talked about it. It was on the newspapers, it was on the TV, it was on the radio. Anytime it came on, it would get shut off. My dad comes back into the room. I set the paper down. He doesn't know I've seen it. And he says to me, come on, kid, pack a bag. We got to go. I said, where are we going? Because I'm just thinking, well, now he's going to move back to the apartment. He's going to live with us. We're just going to be a family again. He said, we're going to your Uncle John and Auntie Connie's house. Now, my mother had been adopted when she was a baby, but this was considered her brother. And we got up. I didn't have a backpack. We were kind of poor. So I grabbed a plastic bag from Market Basket. It was Demoulas back then. And I just threw my pajamas and a toothbrush and maybe some undies or whatever in there. And we just kept crying. My sister kept crying, saying, we just want to stay here with you. We just want to stay here with you. And he said, we got to go. I never slept at that house again. And so what happened was it was a series of losses. You know, so I lost my mom, I lost my dad, I lost my home, I lost everything, and I ended up going to live with an aunt and uncle who I barely knew. So I basically moved in with some strangers. Okay? And there's so many details to this, but we don't have the time, so I'm just going to keep fast forwarding. And so I basically live with them from the time that I'm 12 until the time that I'm 17. And so I'm suffering that whole time, you know. I started drinking. I remember the first time I got high, Jimmy Cardio, down at the Stadium Projects, 12 years old. The first time I got drunk was on Mad Dog. Do you guys remember that stuff? Oh my God. It was terrible. It was terrible. I couldn't walk the next day. Literally could not walk. I had to crawl everywhere around my stepsister's house. And so I started doing all those things at a very young age, right? I actually smoked my first cigarette when I was 8, and we got caught. It was the only time my mother ever hit me. She smacked me right in the mouth because I was being fret. I deserved it, though. It was like she came from Miami, went all the way up to New Hampshire. But I deserved it. Anyway, so I started doing a lot of things because I was suffering, because nobody was talking about it. I had no tools. I didn't know how to work through the pain that I was experiencing. And so I started to look for things outside of myself. Oh, I'll drink. I'll have some fun. And then boys, right? I lost my virginity way too young, way younger than I had any business losing it. Books saved me. Books and writing, journaling, totally saved me. So I spent some time doing that too. Okay, so now I'm living with my aunt and uncle. I get myself somehow miraculously into BU, into Boston University. And what nobody knows is that I've cultivated this plan, okay? They caught the guy that killed my mother. In fact, they caught him the very next day. He was a prominent local businessman. His name was Paul Carvo. And he was sent to prison. And then he got out for a little while because his family had a lot of money. He got out and he was kind of walking around the streets for a little while. And then his trial came in 1982 and he was convicted, life in prison. So he was in prison. I'm at BU. I'm 17, my freshman year. I'm about to turn 18. And I say, I know how I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to ask him why. I said, I'm going to get in my car after finals, and I'm going to go to the Norfolk State Prison, and I'm going to sit down. Now, would they have ever let me in to talk to the guy? I don't know, but this was my plan. I'm going to go talk to him, and I'm going to sit down with him, and as soon as I know why, then I'll be okay. I'll have the answers. My suffering will stop. So it's December 1986. It's like probably around December 15th, 16th, 17th. And, I'm getting ready to go home for Christmas break. I have one more final to take. And I was too poor. I didn't have a phone in my room, so I would be down in the lobby, like in my pajamas, like shoving quarters into the phone to call back home. So I'm calling my boyfriend, Buddy. And I get on the phone with Buddy, to say, hey, I'm coming home in a couple of days or whatever. But Buddy is acting weird. And I'm like, his real name is Francis. So I'm like, Francis, what's going on? He says, Paul Corriveau is dead. And I just lose my mind right there in the lobby. I said, what do you fucking mean Paul Corriveau is dead? He said he hung himself 3 days ago. I slam down the phone and I call my sister, and before she can even answer, hello, I'm like, and what were you going to tell me? And she said, Kay, you were doing finals, like you were doing good. We didn't want to upset you. And nobody knew, because nobody in my family talked about anything. So I just ran upstairs into my room. Of course, I fell on the stairs, cut my shin, blood everywhere. It's a holy mess. And I throw myself on the bed and I cry and cry and cry. Because now I'm screwed. There's my plan to get peace. I go home, Christmas break. It's a few days later. I walk into my stepfather's house, because that's the routine. Right? We would go there on Christmas Eve. And they were all, Italian. I'm like an Irish Catholic kid, from Lawrence. So they're all, my step-family, they're all Italian and Portuguese. They're all around the table with the Crown Royal and the marinara sauce and the octopus and like all this stuff. And my Uncle Manny, all right? Now, my Uncle Manny is the kind of guy, he got a tattoo of an eyeball on his shoulder when he was in his 40s. And I said, Uncle Manny, what's with the tattoo? He goes, that's because when the bastards try to stab me in the back, I see him coming, kid. So my Uncle Manny is like a toast. And so everybody gets quiet around the table. Now, they can't see me. I'm standing in the doorway. They can't see me. And he says, a toast. May that cocksucker rot in hell. And everybody cheers. And I'm standing in the doorway, and I realize in that moment, that's not how I feel. Because in this moment, I remember, he has little kids, Paul Corriveau. He's somebody's kid. He's somebody's father. He's somebody's husband. And there's a crack that happens. You know how Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack in everything, and it's how the light gets in? So in that moment, I stopped seeing this guy who brutally beat my mother to death as a fucking monster and an animal, and I actually started to see him as a human. And so there's this little window where the suffering kind of stops for a second, because now I'm feeling for somebody else. And that taught me something. And I also realized that I didn't know how to talk to my family about these things that I was feeling, so I didn't. And I just did some more stuffing, and I just kind of kept it all to myself, and I journaled and stuff like that. So fast forward, I graduate from BU, I end up moving to California. And I'm still looking for answers. I'm still trying to find a way to get out of my own way, but I don't have any tools. You grow up in Lawrence, it's like somebody hurt you, it's like an eye for an eye. You do something, there was no forgiveness happening in my world. And so the one thing I always had, I never had money, but I would always have books somehow. My mother got me a library card when I was a kid. So when I moved to LA and I didn't know anybody, the way that I would find pieces, I would go into the bookstore. And back then, I was really into bodybuilding. And so I was really into lifting weights. So I was in the health, in the section where all the things were. And while I'm in that section, I hear a voice in my head literally say, you should go over to the self-help section, because you could use some help. And I was like, okay. And so I just start walking over there, and I get in there, and I'm just standing there and looking around, and literally, I shit you not, this is what happens. This book, now there's nobody else in the aisle with me. There's no reason why it should happen, but this book goes like this. And literally falls at my feet. And I look down, and I'm like, who's this broad? I'm like, well, she looks kind of nice. She's got a nice smile. And it's Marianne Williamson, A Return to Love, Reflections on the Principles of A Course in Miracles. And I sit down and I start to read this book right in the store. And this was before, like, Borders would put chairs everywhere. So I'm just sitting on the floor like a poor kid, like usual, like a little weirdo. And I start reading this book. And the things she says in this book both equally inspire me and completely piss me off. Because she's talking in a way that nobody has ever talked before. She's talking about concepts of forgiveness and stuff that nobody has ever said to me before. And I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Okay? So like 2 years goes by, this becomes huge. She's on Oprah, it becomes a huge bestseller. You have all in some way heard the quote, our deepest fear is not that we are, our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure, all these things. So it's been attributed to Nelson Mandela, no. Coach Carter in the movie, no. It's Marianne's quote. So anyways, I start reading this book, and I also pick up the other book that she's always referencing, which is called A Course in Miracles. And it's like a 1,200-page book, and it's called spiritual psychotherapy. And what it promises you is the peace of God through forgiveness. Now, don't get weird about the word God. I always say, like, part of my mission is to make the word God cool again. Because God, when I think of God, it's not like some white dude in the sky who's like rationing out punishment. To me, the word God simply means love. Like, that's it. So, I get this book, I start doing this stuff. Marianne blows up, her career is huge. She's lecturing in LA, but I have no car. I have no way to get down there to see her. But finally, at some point, I get a car, and I start going to her lectures. And then one day, she's doing this workshop on relationships. And I am dating, at this point, a guy named Brenton, who's a magician. Brenton, okay, and so I'm like, all right, he's making me nuts. I'm going to go to this workshop. I'm going to ask a question about relationships. And so I get in line, and there's a mic, and you're going to stand there. And when I get to the microphone, it is literally like something else takes over my body, and I hear myself say, I kind of don't get this whole forgiveness thing. And she's like, darling, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean about that? And I'm like, yeah. So what happened is my mother started coming to me in dreams. And one of the dreams she said to me was, she said, I've forgiven him. Now it's your turn. But I didn't know how. I asked Marianne the question. She brought me up on stage. And she hugs me close. And she whispers in my ear, let me just be your mother for a moment. And I just start to sob. And now the whole Agape church is like crying because we're doing this whole work in front of the whole room. And she says, who else in this room has another issue like this around murder? And like 7 people came forward. And it blew my mind. So we ended up having this whole huge thing. And it was amazing. And people came up to me afterwards and they're like, I've been watching Marianne for years. I've never seen anything like that. Who are you? And I'm just like, I'm just a kid from Boston. Like, I don't know. And eventually, some of Marianne's people said she wants to talk to you. And they pulled me aside. And she said, who are you? And I'm like, I'm Karen. She's like, what do you do? And I'm like, well, I want to be a writer, but I'm a waitress, She's like, we need to stay in touch. I was like, okay. I was so excited because this was like meeting your hero. Like, she was my hero at this point. And so, long story short, we end up developing a relationship. I end up going to live with her and work with her, and she becomes my spiritual mom and mentor to this day. She still is. Some of you might have come to my event. I had her in Concord in February of last year, and she came and spoke for all of us. So it was like 700 people. It was amazing. But it was through living with Marianne and working with Marianne that I was able to start to gather some tools in my toolbox. And I was able to start to free myself. Because what happens is what people don't get, okay? So I had to work on forgiving my mother's killer. Most people, it's like, they never put the toilet seat up, right? We all have our stuff, but we will obsess over the littlest things. So here in the room, raise your hand. I don't care at what magnitude it is, small, big, whatever. Who here has some forgiveness work to do? Who here has a person, it might be yourself or somebody that you're not forgiving? Yeah, right? None of us are alone. And so I started doing this work, and one of the things that Marianne said to me one day, she turned to me and she said, you've got some choices to make. And I was like, I don't know what you mean. Because at that point, I had become a professional victim. I had learned at a very young age that I could pull out that dead mother card anytime, and I could get away with all kinds of shit. Oh, not turning your homework? Oh, my mother just died. And who isn't going to feel bad? I could get away with pretty much anything. And so I learned how to use that as part of my identification. So I started moving through the world leading with my wound. Now imagine now as adults if I came up to you and the first thing I said to you was, when I was 12, my mother was murdered, and then I was totally inappropriately touched, and I was raped, and then I had like 3 miscarriages, and I blah, blah, blah. You'd be like, what the fuck? Who wants to be friends with that girl? But so many of us, that's what we do. We lead with our wounds because we don't have the tools to figure out how to navigate life, man. Just the stuff that happens to all of us. I mean, there's 3 of us up here telling stories, but every single person in this room I know has a story, and I can sit down with you and you can tell me. And the beautiful thing about storytelling is you cannot hear somebody's story without eventually falling in love with them and being able to understand them. And so part of my work was starting to get to know Paul Carabo. So I did a lot of research on his family because A, I'm writing a memoir, I'm writing a book, but B, I wanted to understand what could make a person do such a thing. And I could share a lot with you, but I don't have the time, but read the book when it comes out and you'll learn all about it. But it's what really helped me to start to forgive him. But Marianne said to me, you have some choices to make. She said, you can keep letting what happened to you define you and how you move through the world, or you can choose something else. In A Course in Miracles, there's a beautiful line that says, my brother, you can choose again. I can choose peace instead of this. And what I started to learn, what A Course in Miracles is spiritual psychotherapy. And what I started to learn is if I could change my mind, I could change my world. I could either live from my circumstances or I could start to live from my choices. And so what I started to choose was love over fear. And you've heard this all the time. Yoga teachers love to throw that around, but they don't even know really what they're talking about when they say that because they just say shit. Don't drink the Kool-Aid, okay? Ask them, what do you mean by that? So when we talk about choosing love over fear, what we really mean is choosing divine love, the kind of love that includes everybody. What a lot of us have is what we call special relationships or selective love, or what I call sometimes selective compassion. And so we only extend it to the people we like or the people we love or the people who are easy. But the truth is that we are all one. Yoga teaches us this. That's what yoga means. It means union. It's non-duality, not two, meaning there's only one of us. And so anything that I put out to you, I'm actually doing it to myself. And the thing about not forgiving is, it's so interesting. It's like, we feel really righteous. Well, they did this thing to me. I deserve to be angry. And I'm like, yeah, but you basically are putting this person in your own little personal grievance jail. It's like you created your own little personal prison and then you threw that person in there. And the funny thing about prisons, though, is that when you put people in prison, does everybody just get to go home at the end of the day? Who also has to be in the prison? The gods. So anytime you put somebody in your little personal prison, who's in there with them standing guard? When you practice forgiveness, and I'm not going to go into it because we don't have the time, but when you practice it on that level, there's nothing you can't forgive. And being alive today is like being in the fucking forgiveness Olympics. Okay? So for me, it's like the worst things that could happen to me have already happened. So I'm always just like, bring it. There's really not much you can do at this point that I can't somehow be like, I may not want to hang out with you or have lunch with you, but I can forgive you. And when you can move through the world with that kind of ability to really see people, to really see who they are, to understand their stories, to know that their behaviors, like as we say in A Course in Miracles, it's either a cry for love or it is showing love. Now, if somebody is showing you love, what is the only sane response back? If somebody is crying for love or help, what is the only sane response back? Sometimes the most loving thing you can say is no. Sometimes the most loving thing you can say is you can't just, molest little kids and not go to jail. It's all with the intention in which you're doing it. So forgiveness doesn't mean that you become a doormat. It means you hold people accountable for what they've done. But then you also hold yourself accountable for how you're responding. And what so many of us do is something happens in our life and we react to it. We don't know how to pause. We don't know how to breathe. That is the gift of yoga, is it teaches us how to pause. It teaches us to have that space where we can actually make a choice instead of just reacting. Because your reacting comes from habit. It comes from conditioned thinking. Responding can come from love. And so that's what I learned to do. So I have a really big toolbox now. I have humor in there. That's one of the gifts my mother gave me. We could laugh at anything. I have A Course in Miracles. I have yoga. I have passage meditation. I have all these tools. The difference is that I use them now. It's not enough to just know they're out there. You have to be curious. You have to want to be involved in your own healing. And there's a joke we say in A Course in Miracles. We say, look, even Jesus was only on the cross for 3 days. Get down. We need the wood. Right? But this is what we do. It's like we have these things that cause us to suffer. And we have these things that cause us to suffer. And we forget that, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. But we have these things that happen that cause us to suffer. And instead of pulling out our tools or reading a book or talking to a friend or going to therapy or getting mentoring or whatever you do, right? We choose to build altars to our suffering and then we worship at it. Because we get something from playing small. We don't think we do, but we do. And so the work that I do now in the world as a spiritual mentor is helping people let go of their stories of the past so that they can move forward really vibrantly, really deeply connected to God's spirit, the divine, love, your higher power. I don't care what you call it. But it's moving through the world in a really informed way about the truth of who you are. Aligning yourself with the divine. So that you're not reacting from this small, limited ego sense, that you are really living from this place where you understand who you are and to whom you belong. And if you move through the world that way, you start to see everything as opportunity. And so now for me, no matter what happens, it's not like I don't get pissed off, like something stupid, I got a ticket. No right on red. And I could have complained to the guy and said, look, I'm thinking about my talk about my dead, murdered mother, and I didn't see the sign. But I'm like, no, there's something in it for me. So now I move to the world and I'm like, you know what? Everything is happening for me. It's not happening to me. And when you start to think about life that way, that you are an extension of the divine, that you are a child of God, that you are amazing, not just me, all of us, you can move to the world in a totally empowered way. And that's what I want for everybody. I really believe if people understood who they were, if people knew that they could make a choice, if Paul Carvo knew that he could pause, that he could take a breath, that he could choose again, I believe my mother would still be alive. And so my mission is to create a less violent world. But I start with me. We can't control what anybody else is doing. So your job is to just start working your own little corner of the garden. You can't complain about the shit blowing around your neighborhood if your backyard is a mess. So for me, you start there. And because I want a less violent world, I try to eradicate every bit of violence within myself. And so my compassion didn't just stop at humans, it started to extend out to animals. And no offense, but I will choose a puppy over a baby any day of the week. I love animals. They've always been one of my greatest connections to the divine. And so I realized that my whole life I had been calling myself an animal lover while I was still eating them. And then I thought, well, how can I love them if I'm eating them? And how can I love them if I'm paying somebody else to murder them for me? And I remember around the time that I started thinking about this, my love for animals, the choices I was making, that I was also receiving a lot of information on my research for the book. And one of the questions I'd always ask myself was, did my mother suffer? Because a lot of spiritual people over the years, trying to be kind to me with all their different theories, said, well, you know, when you're fighting for your life in that way, you know, your adrenaline gets so high that, you know, she probably didn't feel anything. And then somebody else said to me, well, I like to think that in acts of violence, the soul leaves the body before they're aware. And so I'd always question this. And I remember getting the newspaper articles from this woman because, remember, my family never ever talked about it. So it wasn't until like 20 years later that I started to figure out what had been going on. And one of the articles said, talking about my mom, she had cuts and scrapes on her hands and knees from trying to get away. And it occurred to me in that moment, like everything just wants to live. Everything wants to be free from harm. And I became vegan. Now, I've been vegan for 14 years now because I just do not want to participate in the suffering of any other living creature. Not you, not my furry friends. And so, to kind of, you know, wrap it up, one of the things I want to say is that, you know, with spiritual mentoring, I know how powerful and effective it is to have a mentor. So I highly encourage you to just find somebody who's doing work that resonates with you, whether it's yoga, chanting, prayer, meditation. I don't care what it is, but find somebody. But one of the things to also remember is I say, like, mentors will take you a long way, but tormentors will take you a wicked long way too. So all these things that are happening to you are happening for you. And to not get small, to actually stand in your power, to remember who you are, know that there are tools, know that you are loved, know that you are powerful beyond measure. You can overcome anything. And when you're inspired, you'll see people doing like the work that Kathleen does. You'll see people doing the work that Sandi does, because it's not about whether you're afraid or not. It's that you are listening to your deep guided mission. And I believe we all have our own individual curriculum. You all have been called here. And there's a line that we say in A Course in Miracles. It says, you know, the divine calls everybody, but not everybody answers. But just you being here tonight, you're all being called to tell your stories, to do the work that you were born to do, and to go out into the world and be totally amazing. And the last thing I want to say is that I was totally blown away when Jennifer was asking me about doing this event. And she said, I said, well, what's the date? And she said, it's on May 6th. And I just kind of like laughed because my mother is hysterical. May 6th, 1981, 36 years ago, was the last night I ever saw my mother alive. And she was found on May 7th, 1981. So tomorrow is the anniversary of her death. So I just want to say thank you all so much for being here with us tonight, being with me, listening to her story. That's part of my mission and legacy, is to tell her story, that we might create a more beautiful and peaceful and just and loving world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen, so much for sharing your inspirational story and also just the light that you share in this world. Let's give it a round of applause for Kathleen, for Sandi, for Karen. Pretty amazing, right?
I have plenty of tissues at the bar.
Feeling inspired to embark on your own call to adventure? If so, harness it. Fuel it. That feeling is the essence of your higher purpose and true being. Unleashing your true being is the greatest expression of love you can give to yourself and to this world.
So what do you guys think? Should we do this again?
Yeah.
So Well, you're in luck. We're back here November 4th, right back here at Liar's Bench to do it all over again. We are in search of 3 amazing storytellers to join us. So if you're going, oh, I want to say something, please find us afterwards. Take a moment, hang out afterwards, get a beer, grab a water, and take a moment to say thank you to our speakers for sharing. That wasn't easy. You guys are like, it feels like inches away from us right here. It's not easy. And a lot of vulnerability and beauty shared tonight. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you all for coming. Please take a moment, if you've taken pictures or if you're going to tag us at hashtag Wild Adventurous Life or Impact Portsmouth. Continue the conversation. Follow us on our website and our newsletter at www.wildadventurouslife.com. Again, thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and here's to your wild, adventurous life.